American Secession by F.H. Buckley, The Looming Threat of a National Breakup. Two smaller chapters here in this middle section of the book, and actually, I kind of feel that it was the most thin, honestly speaking. It wasn't very robust in terms of its analysis, although I did understand the points, and I'll go through them here in a moment. But it was basically just hearkening back to an earlier chapter related to bigness and happiness. It had some things to say, which I'll go through right now. The main question of the chapter, starting on page 89 of the book, was, is bigness a threat to freedom? Buckley gave some analysis of different countries and how they define freedom, and how here in America, others on the outside have seen that with so many potential criminal offenses and 2 million people locked up in American jails, actually, in fact, the highest amount of any population in the world, can America be considered truly free? He went through a historical analysis of how there was the promise of a constitution, but that in the shadow of the Constitution and the rights it gave to its citizens, there was a very large period of time where there was a racially oppressed people, which was only corrected during, really finally, in the civil rights movement. He talked a little bit about how the personal and political freedoms, known as the Washington Consensus, were set up in a way that showed that if a state had a liberalized economy, it creates a middle class, and that middle class in turn demands political freedom, which is in exact opposition to the model that we see in China, which he described as the Beijing Consensus, a rival model, where economic freedom does not actually equal political liberty. In the last 50 or 60 years, it's very clear that the Chinese people have become wealthy. There is a middle class there. I guess if you could call it a middle class. There are Chinese people traveling all over the world. They come to the United States, they send students here, but they don't have any political liberty at home. And he sets forth an argument that in larger political systems, they don't, but the political system itself doesn't guarantee freedom very well. You could have, in fact, legal freedom, but on paper. But if the social disapproval of the behavior is high enough, people won't actually do it. And I guess the example of that would be like political correctness today. Can you say, are you barred from saying certain words, or do you have to believe a certain thing? Or I guess now in these times of COVID, do you have to behave in a certain way? When he was in the middle of that discussion, he talked about how when the book Animal Farm was written by George Orwell, there was a preface that was put in that actually, I guess, was not published until many years later in a reprint in 1972. And I thought it was important enough to actually read the paragraph here, because I think as it is read, you'll feel it very, very familiar. So here it goes on page 91 of the book, the preface that Orwell wrote originally. At any given moment, there is an orthodoxy, a body of ideas, which it is assumed that all right-thinking people will accept without question. It is not exactly forbidden to say this, that, or the other, but it is, quote unquote, not done to say it. Just as in mid-Victorian times it was, quote unquote, not done to mention trousers in the presence of a lady. Anyone who challenges the prevailing orthodoxy finds himself silenced with surprising effectiveness. A genuinely unfashionable opinion is almost never given a fair hearing, either in the popular press or in the highbrow periodicals. How familiar that feels to us, perhaps today, as we think about recent suppression of social media and big tech in the social media giants of Google and Facebook and Twitter, suppressing conservative voices or causing links that could be considered right wing to disappear or perhaps be shadow banned behind the scenes. And the political discussion that could ensue is simply suppressed. So, how in this environment do we measure freedom? He mentions the Freedom House Index of Liberal Democracy, which is a non governmental organization based in Washington, D.C. And he was very quick to note that this particular organization does have some political bias, as the United States itself was downgraded after the 2016 election, basically on the premise of that there was Russian interference, which of course later was proven to be incorrect. But take it for what it is. It does, in fact, try to measure freedom in 195 countries. And it asks the questions: are there protections in place to protect personal and political liberty? Are there fair and free elections? Are minority groups represented properly? And so you can kind of take that for what you will in terms of how accurate that is. But what I guess he found, I guess the takeaway is that it correlates very much to the World Happiness Report that we read about in an earlier chapter. It confirmed that presidential um, types of government are less quote unquote free than parliamentary ones. And the main reason for this is going to feel very, very intuitive. It's going to feel like, well, yes, of course, small countries, politicians know what their people want if they're more in tune with them. People know and understand the character of the representatives that they're putting into government. There's a common value, there's less diversity. And so in smaller countries, there's going to be more happiness and, in fact, reported freedom. He talked a little bit about pluralism and how that the idea the early founders had of lots and lots of people, lots of interests competing in the public sphere would actually allow freedom to reign. But in fact, as the country has gotten large and politicians detached, that they turn to their own self interest, the politicians, and that the sphere, the political sphere, turned into a pay for play kind of swamp. And of course, there's the rise of identity politics, which we are feeling very, very strongly here in the United States over the last few years. It is of note that when the United States was founded, there was one representative to 40,000 people in the House of Representatives. And over the course of time, that has changed to what it currently is. One representative covers 750,000. It's a very big difference. George Washington himself mentioned that it was very, very important to have that ratio of maybe 1 to even 30,000 people. So the idea is that with the representatives structured that way, that no one member wields power when it's a smaller model. But here we have this 1 to 750,000. If we were to extrapolate the old standard of like 1 to 30,000, the current House of Representatives would have 11,000 reps, which would, of course, as I said before, no one member would wield unlimited power. But with 11,000 people, it would also be completely disorganized and probably unable to coordinate things. And maybe on second thought, that's not such a bad idea to have the federal government in such a state of disarray. But the consequence of that probably would be what George Mason referred to as an elective monarch, where basically in that chaos of disorganization, one powerful executive rises to the top. It's a unitary voice. There's an impetus on acting swiftly, not going to be constrained by the legislator. Let's just get it done. And so now we have basically created a monarchy. And so the question then becomes, well, do dictators like that bigness? And probably does bigness invite dictators? And there's a strong case to be made for that. There truly is. The last point of this relatively short chapter is an example of California, which has a population of 40 million people. And with that, it's larger than many countries. And in fact, if we're looking about that secession, you could almost argue it could almost be divided into three countries. And I'm sure there's many Californians that would maybe want that to happen based on the politics of that state, very large state. But currently, there are 80 seats in their assembly, which equates to one representative holding responsibility for 500,000 people. So it's very, very close to the federal standard. And when we contrast that with a smaller state, like he gave the example of South Carolina, but there are certainly others. Um, South Carolina has 170 seats in their assembly, and they have that older standard of one representative for 30,000 people in their population. So it lends to that earlier standard. Now, is South Carolina happier or freer than California? Well, there actually are probably people that would make that case that it is. Inevitably, the smaller states that have a smaller ratio have a more responsive government. I mean, it makes sense because there's just more interaction between the people and the representatives, and that ends the this chapter. It was really quite a short chapter, and as I said, a little on the thin side, I thought. In any case, the next chapter for next time is chapter 9, Bigness and Wealth. I look forward to catching up with you then, and thank you for your interest. If you're enjoying this content, please share it. We want to get this conversation out to other people. This is a really good book, and it really does warrant being shared. So think of 4 or 5 people that you want to share it with who might enjoy hearing it and spread it on out. And if you haven't done so already, hit that like button and, of course, enter some comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this very important topic.